I was known throughout the empire as the perfect lady. At least, that's what everyone used to call me. On the night everything ended, explosions shook the estate while soldiers fought their way through the halls. The sound of battle echoed from every direction, but I stayed where I was and prayed. I didn't ask to be saved. I didn't ask for a miracle. I simply begged to be taken without too much pain. I prayed that I wouldn't lose my courage before that moment arrived. And I prayed that I could keep faith until the very end. Outside, the fighting grew louder. The gates had fallen. Voices shouted through the estate. "Arrest the traitors!" The soldiers were searching for me. Room by room, they closed in. Soon, only one room remained. Mine. A moment later, I heard the order. "Break down the door." The entrance burst open. When I finally looked up, a crowd had gathered beyond the doorway. Soldiers filled the corridor, and at their center stood a figure surrounded by onlookers. There was nowhere left to run. Not that I had tried. All my life, I had been raised for a single purpose: to become the perfect noblewoman. Eventually, I became the second wife of Duke Lancaster. For 1 year and 8 months, I lived as his wife. Then everything changed. The Duke was accused of treason against the Empire. And overnight, I became the wife of a traitor. Now I stood before the imperial throne. The truth is, I was too afraid to run. I was too afraid to collapse on the floor and wait for death. So instead, I dragged over a chair and sat properly while waiting for my arrest. It was pointless. But my dignity was all I had left. Even that wouldn't last long. The nobles gathered in court and argued over who should receive me. Some demanded that His Majesty hand me over to them. Others mocked my situation openly. One even suggested settling the matter through a duel. The hall erupted with laughter. The same people who once praised me now treated me like a prize to be won. I heard them whispering. They spoke about how I had once been called the perfect lady, and how that only made my downfall more entertaining. Then the emperor finally spoke. Seated upon the throne, Emperor D. Marcus Tuberine watched the entire spectacle with a glass in his hand. A smile spread across his face. After listening to the nobles argue, he made his decision. I would be given to Count Laszlo Chrysis, a man who, according to the emperor, was in need of more maids. The court fell silent. My head spun. As I knelt there, I could only think of the prayer I had made earlier. A prayer to the all-powerful Para. Then I slowly raised my eyes. My life as Edele Lancaster, the Empire's perfect lady, was already over. And whatever waited for me next was about to begin. Everyone thought my downfall began when my husband was declared a traitor. But the truth is, it started much earlier. 3 years ago, before I became the Duchess of Lancaster, I was still Edele Canyon. And my future had already been decided for me. My mother kept insisting that I was being stubborn. She couldn't understand why I was resisting the marriage. The man they wanted me to marry was older than my own father. I remember staring at father's portrait and asking how I was supposed to accept that. But mother had already made up her mind. According to her, there wasn't a better match in the empire. The Duke's wife had died long ago. His children were already grown. And, because of that, she assured me I wouldn't have to worry about producing heirs. Then she revealed what truly mattered. When the Duke died, I would inherit everything. To her, that was the perfect future. I tried to argue. I pointed out that nobody knew when the Duke would die. By then, I might already be 30. But mother only looked at me with frustration. Then she said something I never forgot. Once I became a duchess, even father would have to bow before me. The moment those words left her mouth, everything became clear. This marriage was never about me. It was about status, power, prestige. I asked what exactly was so appealing about becoming the Duchess of one of the Empire's 4 great families. But my opinion didn't matter. The decision had already been made. I begged father to reconsider. I told him this wasn't what I wanted. I pleaded with him to listen. Instead, he became furious. He demanded to know whether I understood the humiliation he had endured in order to secure this marriage. According to him, I should have been helping the family rather than resisting. As I sat there listening, I realized something. My destiny had been decided long before I was ever asked what I wanted. And eventually, I became the Duchess of Lancaster. Back then, everyone praised my life. They called me fortunate, elegant, perfect. But now, looking back, it feels like I was nothing more than an empty shell. Sometimes I wonder if all the pain I endured back then was a warning. Maybe it was a sign telling me to run. A sign I ignored. Now I'm sitting behind iron bars. A prisoner. The Empire calls me the spoils of war. But that's only because slavery was abolished long ago. The reality isn't much different. I'm property, a possession being handed from one owner to another. While I sit in my cell, visitors arrive. Not to help me, not to comfort me. They come to mock me. The first is Lauren Lancaster, the Duke's eldest daughter. The second is Daria Lancaster, his younger daughter. They accuse me of acting superior. They ridicule the reputation I once had as the Empire's perfect lady. According to them, I've always behaved that way ever since marrying into the family. They remind me that my own family sold me off. They mock the title I once carried. They call me a traitor, an ungrateful wretch. And they insist that my father betrayed everyone. As I listen, I realize this isn't the first time they've disapproved of me. But something is different now. They're no longer trying to hide their contempt. They're exhausted. They've completely given up. So instead of arguing, I tell them both to get some sleep. I have no interest in wasting what little energy I have on meaningless insults. Because sooner or later, there will come a moment when the guards stop paying attention. And when that moment comes, I'll need enough strength left to end my own life. I'd rather die than become someone's possession. All the Lancaster men are dead. And the House of Canyon survived only by abandoning me. So there's nothing left for me. Nothing worth clinging to. Later, I find myself being transported by carriage. As I look outside, a thought enters my mind. Maybe this is my chance. If the servant watching me isn't paying close attention, I could jump from the carriage. If Count Laszlo's estate is located among other noble residences, there should be plenty of traffic on the roads. Enough confusion. Enough witnesses. Maybe I could disappear. My heart starts pounding. For the first time since my sentencing, I see a possible opportunity. A possible escape. And as the carriage continues forward, I begin preparing myself to take that chance. But whether I can actually do it is another matter entirely. The carriage continued to rattle along the road. Every jolt reminded me that my chance was slipping away. Across from me sat the man who now owned my fate. Count Chrysis. I hadn't expected him to come personally. Someone of his status could easily have sent a servant. Instead, he had chosen to retrieve me himself. That made me uneasy. Perhaps he simply didn't trust anyone else to keep watch over me. Or perhaps he wanted to make certain I didn't escape. I stole a glance toward him. His expression was unreadable. Cold. Detached. The face of a man who had spent years commanding armies. Why would someone like him ever look favorably upon me? I was the wife of a traitor. A remnant of a disgraced house. Nothing more. My fingers trembled in my lap. I tried to hide it, but he noticed immediately. Without warning, he unclasped the crimson cloak draped across his shoulders. The heavy fabric settled around me before I could react. For a moment, I simply stared. "What are you doing?" I asked. His golden eyes met mine. Then stopped shivering. Only then did I realize how badly my hands had been shaking. The warmth of the cloak settled around my shoulders. My heart beat a little faster. So that was why he had given it to me. Not kindness. Not concern. Simply because I looked cold. Still, the warmth felt strange. Dangerous. I lowered my gaze. If I wrapped the cloak around him again, if I created enough confusion, would it buy me enough time to open the carriage door? Enough time to jump? The thought returned immediately. I tightened my grip on the fabric. But another image followed. The spinning wheels beneath the carriage. The unforgiving stone road. If I leapt at the wrong moment, I wouldn't escape. I'd be crushed. The distant sound of another carriage echoed through the air. I closed my eyes. This was my chance. I would count to 3. Then I would open the door. 1. The carriage rattled onward. 2. I shifted slightly toward the door. Before I could continue, a calm voice interrupted me. "It'd be better if you didn't do that." My entire body froze. Slowly, I looked up. Count Chrysis hadn't moved. His arms remained folded. His eyes were still closed. Yet somehow he knew exactly what I had been planning. The realization sent a chill through me. He knows. Of course he knows. That was why he had come personally. That was why he hadn't taken his eyes off me. The rest of the journey passed in silence. When the carriage finally stopped, I stepped outside and found myself staring at an enormous estate. The mansion towered over everything around it. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. This would be my prison now. Or so I thought. "Follow me," Count Chrysis said. I obeyed. Inside, servants hurried to greet him. A woman I assumed was the head housekeeper bowed deeply. Count Chrysis asked whether anything unusual had happened during his absence. The housekeeper assured him everything was normal. Then his attention shifted toward me. "Didn't you say you were short on maids?" The woman blinked. "I did, my lord. Here's a new maid." For a moment, nobody spoke. I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. "A maid? Me? Give her a bath," he continued. "Feed her. Find her a room." The housekeeper looked completely stunned. "So did I. You can put her in any unused room. She'll begin work tomorrow." And with that, he turned and walked away. I stared after him. He wasn't sending me to his bedroom. He wasn't treating me like a spoil of war. He wasn't even treating me like a prisoner. Was he really planning to use me as an ordinary maid? The servants seemed just as confused as I was. Whispers quickly spread through the hall. Some of them recognized me immediately. The former Duchess of Lancaster. A prisoner of war. A fallen noblewoman. The reactions weren't kind. A few servants laughed. Others looked at me with open curiosity. Some seemed delighted by my humiliation. The head housekeeper quickly silenced them and ordered one of the maids to escort me away. I expected mockery. Perhaps even cruelty. Instead, they prepared a bath for me. They brought me clean clothes. Later, they even delivered food directly to my room. The room itself was small compared to the mansions I once lived in. Yet it was warm, clean, comfortable. As I sat alone that night, I found myself staring at the candlelight. They were kinder than I expected. And Count Crisis. I still couldn't understand him at all. That night, sleep came more easily than I expected. The bed was warm. The room was quiet. And for the first time in what felt like forever, nobody was watching me. I should have been grateful. Instead, I found myself wondering about Count Crisis. Nothing about him made sense. A man who purchased a prisoner of war. A man feared across the empire. A mercenary who had risen from common birth to nobility through sheer military achievement. Yet after bringing me to his estate, he had treated me as though I were an ordinary servant. Why? I closed my eyes. No matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't find an answer. Eventually, exhaustion won. And somewhere else in the estate, Count Crisis was thinking about me as well. According to rumors, he had personally collected me from the prison. Many people assumed he had done so because I was once the Duchess of Lancaster. Others believed he wanted to humiliate a fallen noble. Neither explanation was correct. Years ago, during the victory banquet that followed the war, Count Crisis had stood before the Emperor himself. The Emperor had offered him anything he desired. Land, titles, influence, power. But Crisis had refused everything beyond the reward promised in their contract. He had never cared for status. Never cared for noble society. To him, titles were little more than decorations. That attitude was precisely why the Emperor found him useful. And dangerous. A man who could not be controlled by ambition was difficult to predict. Still, there was one thing that had caught Crisis' attention. Me. Or rather, the circumstances surrounding me. The Emperor had handed me over as a warning to anyone foolish enough to oppose the throne. A disgraced duchess. A living example. But Crisis understood something others didn't. If he had refused to take me, I would have been sold elsewhere. Or I would have found a way to die. Those had been my only choices. After all, I had been abandoned by everyone. My husband was dead. The Lancaster family had fallen. Even my own father had sacrificed me to save himself. Most people believed I attempted suicide because of wounded pride. Because I couldn't accept becoming a servant. Crisis disagreed. He thought that explanation was too simple. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself wondering whether there was still something worth saving inside me. If I could let go of the past, perhaps my future wouldn't be as hopeless as it seemed. The next morning, I started my work as a maid. I was assigned to the laundry room and quickly learned that not everyone in the estate welcomed me. One maid suddenly called out to me and threw a dirty rag onto my work cart. She mocked me for using old rags and asked whether I had been too afraid to get my hands dirty while washing them. The dirty water splashed across the cart. Instead of arguing, I lowered my head and simply apologized. "I'll do better." That only encouraged her. She called over another maid named Salia and questioned whether I had been trained properly. Then she ordered everyone to keep a close eye on me. According to her, I was a traitor from the House of Lancaster and couldn't be trusted. The surrounding maids laughed at the accusation. Not everyone joined in, though. One maid quietly asked whether saying things like that could cause problems later. The woman laughed it off. She claimed nobody would care. The Duke was dead and no one would come back to defend his former wife. Nearby maids whispered among themselves while the ridicule continued. This wasn't random harassment. Madame Bohen had deliberately placed me in this position. The maid in charge of the laundry room was Salia, and Bohen had specifically chosen her to train a former duchess. Instead of reacting, I focused on my work. If I caused trouble, everyone in the laundry room would suffer for it. So I decided to finish the work in front of me first. I scrubbed the laundry, washed the clothes, and ignored the comments around me. The ridicule didn't bother me nearly as much as the work itself. My real problem was that I wasn't sure I had the stamina to keep up with it all. Still, I reminded myself of one thing. I was alive. And for now, that was enough. From what I later learned, my father completely lost his temper after hearing what had happened to me. A teacup shattered across the floor as he raged inside the Canyon estate. The moment my name came up, he exploded. "Don't mention that worthless girl." He called me an ingrate and cursed the fact that I had become the mercenary's maid. To him, everything he had done was for House Canyon. Everything had been a sacrifice to protect the family. And, somehow, I was the one who had ruined it all. Soon afterward, father appeared before the emperor. Kneeling before the throne, he begged for mercy and claimed Duke Lancaster had forced him into treason. According to him, I had been used as a hostage. He insisted he had no choice. The emperor listened without interrupting. Then he asked a simple question. If House Canyon was truly innocent, did father have any objection to whatever happened to Duchess Edeli Lancaster? Father didn't hesitate. Not even for a moment. He agreed. Once a daughter marries, he said, she is no longer part of her original family. I had nothing to do with House Canyon anymore. Then he went even further. He reminded the emperor of everything he had already done to survive. The information he had provided. The humiliation he had endured. The assets he had surrendered. Anything to save himself. As he stood before the throne, father became convinced that Emperor D. Marcus Tuberine was using House Canyon as an example to keep the nobility under control. Of course, I knew none of this at the time. I was busy dealing with a far more immediate problem. Laundry. Strange as it sounds, I had become surprisingly good at it. If someone had told the former Duchess of Lancaster that she would one day take pride in washing clothes, I would have laughed in their face. Yet after spending weeks in the laundry room, I could honestly say I worked hard as a maid. Unfortunately, there was still one problem I couldn't wash away. Madame Bohen. The woman never seemed to run out of reasons to bother me. One day, she stormed into the laundry room again and immediately started causing another disturbance. Then she demanded to know whether I was deliberately ignoring her. Before things could escalate, Salia stepped in. She pointed out that I had only recently started learning and was already doing well. Then she reminded Bohen that she was the one training me. If there was a problem, Salia would handle it herself. Bohen tried to argue. Salia wasn't interested. As the person responsible for the laundry room, she reminded Bohen that everyone was already overwhelmed with work and asked her to stop interfering. The two went back and forth for a while. Eventually, Bohen realized she wasn't getting anywhere. Before leaving, she warned us that she would be watching. Only after she disappeared did the room finally relax. One of the maids quietly wondered whether it had really been a good idea to confront Bohen like that. Salia brushed the concern aside. She insisted she hadn't done it for me. According to her, Bohen's constant interruptions were becoming a nuisance for everyone. Even so, I thanked her. Salia looked embarrassed the moment I did. Almost immediately, she changed the subject and told everyone to get back to work. And just like that, the laundry room returned to normal. For the first time since arriving at the estate, it felt a little easier to breathe. I had only been at the estate for a short time when someone knocked on my door late at night. At first, I hesitated. Who could possibly be visiting me at this hour? Then a timid voice came from outside. She introduced herself as Daisy, the maid from the room next door, and asked if she could come in for a moment. I recognized the name. I had passed her a few times in the hallways, but we had barely spoken before. After inviting her inside, I asked why she had come. Daisy seemed nervous. She rummaged through the bundle she brought with her and carefully pulled out several small bottles. It's ointment and cream for when you're hurt. I stared at the medicine in confusion. Why was she giving this to me? Then Daisy explained. She lived in the room right next to mine. The walls were thin. Every night, she could hear me groaning in pain. The words immediately embarrassed me. I hadn't realized anyone could hear me. Daisy quickly apologized and told me she hadn't meant to eavesdrop. Still, she was worried. She had also heard about the trouble Madame Bohen was giving me. On top of that, I was still adjusting to the work while constantly dealing with pain. That was why she brought the medicine. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. No one had shown me that kind of kindness since arriving at the estate. The next day, I was suddenly summoned. A servant informed me that I was needed in the first-floor sitting room. As I followed the servant through the mansion, questions filled my head. Count Laszlo Crisis had called for me without warning. What could he possibly want? I tried to reassure myself. There would probably be other people present. Nothing unusual would happen. Even so, I couldn't stop wondering why he wanted to see me. When I arrived, the servant opened the door and told me to enter. Count Laszlo Crisis was already waiting inside. I introduced myself and told him I had come because he requested me. Then he gestured toward a seat. "Take a seat." I obeyed. But sitting across from him did nothing to calm my nerves. For some reason, every time I looked at him, I felt overwhelmed. After a brief silence, he finally spoke. "Are you familiar with Dowager Marchioness Barbara Celestine?" The name caught me completely off guard. Barbara Celestine. Why was he suddenly asking about her? Barbara wasn't just another noble. She was someone I knew personally. Someone who had always treated me kindly. Before I could make sense of the situation, Count Laszlo handed me a letter. The sender was Barbara Celestine herself. As I read it, I learned why he had called me here. Barbara had contacted Count Laszlo regarding me. She wanted to take me into her service. The request wasn't an order. It wasn't a demand. It was a letter expressing concern for my situation and asking whether I could be entrusted to her care. I couldn't hide my surprise. After everything that had happened, after losing my title, my home, and my family, someone still remembered me. Count Laszlo noticed my reaction. Then he pointed out something I hadn't even realized. I was trembling the entire time. "You're trembling as if I'm about to cut someone's head off." The moment the words left Laszlo's mouth, he realized his mistake. Considering who Idili was, it was probably the worst thing he could have said. After all, he was the man who had led the campaign against House Lancaster. For a brief moment, Laszlo looked annoyed with himself before returning to the real reason he had called her. He wanted to know why Dowager Marchioness Barbara Celestine cared so much about Idili. Why was she willing to go this far for her? Idili lowered her eyes toward the letter. Then she calmly answered. Laszlo had only followed the Emperor's orders and claimed victory. There was no reason for him to feel uncomfortable discussing it. In her opinion, the unusual thing wasn't what happened to House Lancaster. The unusual thing was that she was still alive. Laszlo stared at her silently. The answer wasn't what he expected. Most people in her situation would have blamed him. Yet Idili showed neither anger nor resentment. The more he looked at her, the harder she became to understand. After a long silence, Laszlo brought the conversation back to Barbara's letter. Then he made a suggestion that caught Idili completely off guard. He told her to write a reply. Idili blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to allow it so easily. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Later that evening, Idili returned after washing up with Daisy. The weather was cold, and the estate still didn't have hot water. As they walked back together, Idili found herself thinking about the younger maid. Daisy had quietly helped her from the very beginning. She had even brought ointment after noticing the pain Idili was hiding. After saying goodnight, Idili returned to her room. That's when she noticed something waiting on the table. Paper. Ink. A pen. Laszlo had already prepared everything. He truly intended for her to write back. Idili sat down immediately. There was so much she wanted to tell Barbara. Yet the moment she looked at the blank page, writing became difficult. If Laszlo checked the letter before sending it, she couldn't simply write whatever she wanted. For a while, she sat there in silence. Then she finally picked up the pen. Dear Dowager Marchioness Celestine. The greeting felt strange. Too formal. Too distant. Barbara had never been distant with her. As she continued writing, memories slowly resurfaced. The first time she met Barbara. 7 years earlier. At a tea party hosted by Countess Roderick. Back then, Idili was still young. But there was something unusual about the guest list. Countess Roderick and Barbara were well known for disliking each other. Yet Barbara had still been invited. The invitation itself felt strange. Idili soon learned why. Many of the guests whispered that Countess Roderick hadn't invited Barbara out of courtesy. She had invited her to humiliate her. Barbara used prosthetic legs. And according to the rumors circulating through the party, Countess Roderick wanted everyone to see them. Then Barbara arrived. The moment she entered the venue, whispers immediately spread through the room. People stared at her prosthetic legs and openly whispered behind her back. The room quickly filled with gossip and ridicule. Everyone seemed more interested in Barbara's condition than in greeting her properly. Idili stepped forward. She approached Barbara directly. "My goodness, my lady. What a coincidence. Do you remember me?" Idili reminded her about a time when her carriage had broken down in town. Barbara had helped her and refused any payment. The sudden conversation immediately pulled attention away from Barbara's leg. And for the first time since entering the room, Barbara looked genuinely surprised. The brief conversation left a strong impression on both of them. The guests then became distracted by another topic. A viscountess named Oberon was seeking a divorce. That alone was enough to shock the noblewomen. But the gossip didn't stop there. Someone claimed House Oberon had nearly gone bankrupt after being scammed. Another said the viscountess had started working outside the house as an interpreter. The criticism quickly became more personal. Some guests questioned why a married woman would earn money herself. Others argued that she was damaging her husband's authority. And before long, the woman's reputation was being torn apart by people who didn't know the full story. Watching the conversation unfold, Idili was stunned. She had never realized how quickly noble society could destroy someone's reputation. Then Barbara finally decided she had heard enough. The Dowager Marchioness calmly set down her teacup and addressed the room. Barbara compared the situation to a sinking ship, saying that when a family was struggling, a person naturally did everything possible to keep it afloat. She pointed out that the Viscountess had simply worked hard because she wanted things to improve. Then Barbara asked a simple question. "What is wrong with ambition like that?" The room immediately reacted. Not everyone agreed with her. Countess Roderick argued that Barbara was speaking too boldly and questioned how a woman's work could be compared to that of a man. She referred to Viscountess Oberon as someone who had failed in her duties as a lady. Barbara remained calm. She answered that Viscountess Oberon was a progressive woman who earned a living to make up for what her husband had failed to provide. That response only made the atmosphere colder. People began talking about Barbara herself. Some claimed she had devoured her own husband. Others said she had lectured her husband about his affairs since she was young. Another suggested that Barbara saw herself in Viscountess Oberon. The other guests laughed and encouraged Countess Roderick not to pay attention to Barbara's words because they felt the same way she did. Idili watched everything unfold. Then the memory shifted. After the tea party ended, Idili hurried after Barbara before she could leave. She stopped her and apologized. Earlier, Idili admitted that she had felt sorry for Barbara. Now she realized she had been wrong. She told Barbara that she was stronger than anyone else in that room. Then Idili said something she truly meant. She wanted to become as strong as Barbara Celestine. Gathering her courage, Idili asked if she could occasionally visit her. Barbara smiled. She welcomed the idea and said she would love to have those discussions. From that day onward, the two spent a great deal of time together. They talked often. And before Idili realized it, Barbara had become her friend. Looking back, Idili believed that Barbara probably loved her more than anyone else in the world. But the memory didn't end there. A darker memory surfaced. Idili remembered Barbara desperately trying to stop her from making a sacrifice. Barbara told her never to get used to sacrificing herself. She specifically pleaded with Idili not to marry the old Lord Lancaster and urged her to free herself from the men who were trying to control her. When Idili replied that disobeying her father would leave her with no option except death, Barbara was shocked. She immediately demanded to know why Idili would have to die. Barbara grabbed her and begged her to ask for help. She promised that if Idili reached out, she would help her with everything. The memories slowly faded, and Idili was left with one painful realization. That had been her last encounter with Barbara. Back in the present, Idili sat alone with the unfinished letter in front of her, overwhelmed by the memories that had returned. Idili sits in front of the letter she has been writing to Barbara. She apologizes, saying, "I'm sorry, Barbara." Then she expresses a final wish, hoping the letter will bring Barbara some peace of mind and ease her worries. The scene shifts. A maid informs Madame Bohen that Count Canyon summoned Idili during the day and that she has already left. Bohen initially thinks it wasn't anything serious, but immediately changes her attitude and calls Idili a menace who shouldn't be taken lightly. The conversation turns toward the other servants. Bohen complains about Salia and mentions that Layla and Daisy are no different. She says she will make sure they know their place and keep their heads down. Then her thoughts move toward money and authority. She talks about making people pay tribute and seems pleased with the control she holds. At that point, another maid reminds her about a different problem. Some servants have been complaining because they've had to bathe with cold water. Suspicion has even started spreading because one person always seems to have access to warm water. Bohen is shocked that the secret was noticed. The maid admits she covered it up with excuses. She reveals that warm water has been reserved exclusively for herself and Bohen, and mentions paying 100 ling tons every month for it. Instead of being worried, Bohen laughs. She says that once items from the estate are sold, any losses will be recovered. When warned that Lady Linnea could discover what is happening, Bohen dismisses the concern. She insists that Linnea trusts her completely, Count Chrysis is rarely home, and that eventually the entire estate's wealth will end up in her own pockets. Elsewhere in the mansion, the maids are busy cleaning. Several servants complain about the endless laundry and the amount of unnecessary work they have been forced to do. One maid assumes Madame Bohen must have misunderstood something again and wonders where she is. Another guesses that Bohen is probably whispering strange ideas into Lady Linnea's ear as usual. The scene confirms exactly that. Bohen is with Lady Linnea, speaking privately. She presents herself as a loyal and trustworthy servant, claiming she has always been truthful. She encourages Linnea to leave social affairs and management of the estate to her. Linnea eventually agrees and tells her to do as she thinks best. Bohen reassures her that the estate will run perfectly under her supervision. Later, after a full day of cleaning, Daisy complains that her shoulders, arms, and entire body ache from all the wiping and mopping. Idili praises her for working hard. Then Daisy notices something strange. The entire mansion was cleaned from top to bottom without warning. She asks whether guests are expected, because otherwise there is no obvious reason for such a massive cleaning effort. After the exhausting day of cleaning, Daisy looked around the spotless estate and finally voiced what everyone had been wondering. If there were no guests coming, then why had they suddenly cleaned the entire mansion from top to bottom? Another maid dismissed the idea immediately. No guests ever came to this house. As far as she knew, the head housekeeper was probably just in one of her moods again. But Idili couldn't help thinking about it. She had already spent a month living here. In all that time, she had never seen a single visitor. That struck her as odd. Count Chrysis was a nobleman. Yet no nobles seemed to visit the estate. At first, Idili wondered if it was because of the countless rumors surrounding him. After all, she herself had formed a negative impression of Count Chrysis before arriving. But after living in his household, her opinion had slowly changed. Compared to the stories she had heard, Count Chrysis had been surprisingly generous toward her. And despite his reputation, he didn't seem like a terrible person. As Idili thought about it, she realized something else. The only reason she was able to live such an ordinary life now was because he had allowed it. Before she could think any further, Daisy interrupted her thoughts. The blonde maid explained that the estate occasionally went through these sudden cleaning frenzies because of Lady Linnea. Idili looked surprised. Lady Linnea? Daisy nodded. Lady Linnea was Count Chrysis's younger sister. Idili had heard the name before. Then Daisy lowered her voice and shared another rumor. Quite a few servants had left because of Lady Linnea. According to Daisy, Lady Linnea could be difficult whenever she was in a bad mood. What confused the maids most was that Linnea had never worked a day in her life, yet she constantly involved herself in their work. Idili listened quietly. Then the conversation shifted toward the Chrysis family itself. Daisy explained that Count Chrysis had made a great deal of money from a young age. Even before becoming nobles, the family had never struggled to put food on the table. That fact seemed important. It explained a lot about the way the siblings viewed the world. As Daisy continued talking, she bluntly admitted that she didn't understand Lady Linnea. If her brother had worked so hard to raise their family into nobility, shouldn't she simply appreciate what she had? Instead, Daisy found her immature. Idili remained silent. Then a thought crossed her mind. The Chrysis siblings had become nobles almost overnight. And she herself had experienced the exact opposite. She had gone from being a duchess to becoming a maid almost overnight. In a strange way, their situations mirrored each other. Idili thought about everything she had learned since arriving at the estate. She had learned how to wash laundry. She had learned how to do work she had never imagined doing before. Before coming here, she knew nothing about any of it. The experience had taught her something important. When people are suddenly placed into an entirely different life, they don't automatically know how to live it. And as Idili reflected on the Chrysis family, another possibility occurred to her. Maybe Count Chrysis and Lady Linnea were still learning too. Maybe they didn't really know how to live as nobles. Despite Count Chrysis being part of the Emperor's inner circle, the mansion felt neglected and disorganized. There was no proper butler overseeing the household, and most of the authority seemed to rest with the head maid, Madame Bohen. The more Idili thought about it, the more she wondered if she had been looking at the situation the wrong way. Maybe the family wasn't malicious. Maybe they simply didn't know any better. Curious, Idili asked Daisy whether all the maids who had left the estate had done so because of Lady Linnea. Daisy quickly shook her head. According to her, plenty of servants had quit because of Madame Bohen instead. The problem was that Count Chrysis always provided good recommendation letters, so people blamed Lady Linnea while keeping quiet about the head maid. As they talked, Idili recalled the recommendation letter Count Chrysis had written for her. He really did seem frightening at first glance. But despite his cold appearance, he had consistently treated her fairly. That only made the estate's problems stand out even more. This wasn't some collapsing noble house struggling to survive. The Chrysis family had only recently entered the nobility, and because they were closely tied to Emperor D. Marcus Tuberine, they needed to establish themselves among the aristocracy. To do that, Count Chrysis would eventually need powerful allies. And in noble society, marriage was often the easiest way to secure them. As Idili considered that possibility, another thought entered her mind. If Count Chrysis married someone one day, she found herself hoping that woman would be kind enough to pity her. The next day, Idili was unexpectedly summoned. When she arrived, she found herself standing before Lady Linnea Chrysis for the first time. Linnea sat comfortably in a chair, dressed in an extravagant red outfit, her posture relaxed as she looked Idili over from head to toe. The first thing she said was, "So you're the famous Idili Lancaster?" Idili politely corrected her. She explained that she was simply Idili now, since House Lancaster no longer existed. Linnea immediately replied that she already knew that. The blunt response left Idili wondering if she had somehow offended her. At the same time, Idili quietly observed the young noblewoman. She realized she didn't even know Linnea's age. Looking at her, Idili guessed she might still be in her late teens. And despite all the stories she had heard, Linnea didn't seem especially threatening. Then the questions began. Linnea frowned and brought up Idili's former husband. She referred to Duke Lancaster as an old geezer and asked how Idili could possibly marry someone like him. Then she bluntly asked whether Idili had wanted to become a duchess that badly. Idili calmly answered. She explained that she had never been given a choice in the matter. Her father had ordered the marriage, and she had no option but to obey. Linnea immediately looked disgusted. She couldn't understand how a father could force his daughter into something like that. Hearing those words caught Idili off guard. A young girl she had only just met understood something that her own father never had. But Linnea wasn't finished. After a moment, she leaned forward and asked another question. If Duke Lancaster was so old, then how had Idili shared a bedchamber with him? Idili explained that she never did. The Duke had a long-time concubine and stayed with her instead. The answer completely stunned Linnea. Idili then added that the concubine had been involved in the Duke's rebellion and was probably dead by now as well. Linnea stared at her in disbelief. Then she asked the question that made Idili hesitate. If that was the case, then what exactly was your role in that house? Idili lowered her gaze. Memories she hadn't wanted to revisit began resurfacing. Idili fell silent for a moment. Then she finally answered Linnea's question. There had once been a time when she truly believed things would get better. She thought that if she proved her competence, fulfilled every duty expected of her, and became the perfect duchess, her efforts would eventually be recognized. But reality had been cruel. No matter how hard she worked, she had only been maintaining appearances. She was never treated as a real wife, a real duchess, or even a valued member of the household. She simply carried out unpleasant tasks while preserving the image of a perfect noble family. Looking back now, Idili could only think one thing. What a foolish life she had lived. As that realization crossed her mind, a faint smile appeared on her face. The smile immediately caught Linnea's attention. "Why are you smiling like that?" she demanded. Idili blinked in confusion. Before she could answer, Linnea's expression darkened. The young noblewoman convinced herself that Idili was secretly mocking her. "You were looking down on me too, weren't you?" Linnea accused. Idili looked genuinely bewildered. "Pardon?" she asked. But Linnea had already worked herself into a frenzy. Breathing heavily, she ordered Idili to kneel immediately. Idili froze. Not because she was offended. Because she genuinely didn't understand what was happening. Still, after a brief pause, she calmly lowered herself onto her knees. The sight shocked Linnea. What are you doing? She asked, trembling. Linnea expected resistance. She expected outrage. She expected the former Duchess of Lancaster to refuse. Instead, Idili simply answered, "You are my employer. And my knees aren't that expensive." Those simple words carried years of pain behind them. The pride and honor she once believed in had already been destroyed long ago. To Idili, kneeling wasn't humiliating anymore. Survival mattered more than empty titles. But Linnea couldn't accept that answer. She trembled with anger. "Have you no pride?" she demanded. "You were a duchess." Idili quietly corrected her. "I am no longer a duchess." Then she spoke words that stunned Linnea. The pride and honor of nobility had little value when they failed to protect people. Linnea stood frozen. For the first time, she wasn't seeing Idili. She was seeing every noble who had ever mocked her. Every aristocrat who sneered at her common birth. Every noble who treated her family like outsiders despite their achievements. Her emotions exploded. She accused nobles of hypocrisy. Of ridiculing people after inviting them into society. Of acting superior while living off the sacrifices of others. Idili finally understood. This anger wasn't really directed at her. Lady Linnea was fighting ghosts from her past. She was using Idili as a stand-in for the aristocrats she hated. Unable to control her emotions any longer, Linnea pointed toward the door. "Get out of my room." "No. I don't want to see you." Idili quietly accepted the order and left. As the door closed behind her, she finally understood the truth. For a moment, she stood in the hallway and reflected on everything that had just happened. If Linnea had been born into a noble family from the beginning, she probably would have grown up free and happy. Instead, she had spent her life fighting for acceptance. And now every wound she carried seemed to surface whenever she looked at someone like Idili. His story shifted into a memory. A young girl stood crying. Her name was Linny Canyon, Idili's younger sister. Tears streamed down Linny's face as she struggled to hold herself together. Standing beside her, Idili desperately tried to comfort her. She told Linny that things would get better. That once she was married, her situation would improve. She only needed to endure a little longer. But Linny suddenly cried out. "No!" The outburst stopped Idili in her tracks. Linny's hands trembled uncontrollably. Her entire body shook as years of pain finally spilled out. Looking directly at her sister, Linny said they were different. Idili could endure. Idili was strong. But she wasn't. She had already endured as much as she possibly could. There was nothing left inside her. Then came the words that shattered Idili's heart. "My life isn't worth living anymore." Linny broke down completely. As Idili rushed toward her, all she could do was watch her younger sister collapse under the weight of her suffering. As Idili's memories continued to surface, she found herself thinking about House Canyon. There wasn't much history behind the family. Everything began with Idili's great-grandfather. He was a gambling addict who unexpectedly acquired land containing a sapphire mine. After becoming wealthy, he offered a large amount of gold to the emperor. The money helped the royal family during a period of financial difficulty, and House Canyon was eventually elevated into the nobility. But despite their title, the Canyons were still viewed as nouveau riche nobles. They possessed wealth, but not the dignity or prestige of the old aristocratic families. Idili's memory shifted to her childhood. Lynn Canyon sat in front of their father during a lesson. Their father asked her to name the 4 most prestigious noble families. Nervously, Lynn began answering. She named House Lancaster and House Barrington. Before she could continue, a sharp smack echoed through the room. Their father immediately declared her answer wrong. Then he called on Idili instead. 12-year-old Idili calmly listed the remaining great houses, and this time their father approved. Holding a cane in his hand, he reminded both daughters that those families possessed influence so great that even the royal family could not ignore them. Then he pointed directly at them. He told his daughters never to forget one thing. One day, they would have to marry into one of those families. Only then, he said, would nobody be able to look down on House Canyon. Lynn quietly lowered her head. "Yes, father." The memory moved forward. After the lesson ended, the 2 sisters walked through the hallway together. Lynn suddenly asked a question. "When I'm 12 years old, will I become more like you?" The question caught Idili by surprise. Lynn looked down and called herself a fool. She believed their father's criticism and seemed genuinely upset by it. Idili immediately denied it. She told her younger sister that she wasn't a fool. Lynn hesitated. She explained that their father had said otherwise. Idili gently defended him. She said their father could be harsh with his words and probably only wanted Lin to do better. Then she assured her sister that he didn't actually think she was foolish. Lin looked up. You think so? Idili smiled and took her hand. Instead of dwelling on the lesson, she suggested they go downstairs and have some cookies together. She even offered to share hers. When they finished eating, Idili promised she would help Lin study. Hearing that, Lin finally smiled. And for a brief moment, the sadness on her face disappeared. The two sisters continued walking together through the mansion. But the peaceful moment didn't last. When they reached the kitchen, a servant stopped them. At Count Canyon's orders, Lin was forbidden from having any snacks. The servant reminded her that she had performed poorly on her test and hadn't even finished her homework. Lin looked devastated. Then, after a brief hesitation, she quietly told Idili to enjoy the snack without her. She said she would return to her room and work on her homework instead. Before Idili could stop her, Lin ran off. Watching her younger sister leave, Idili could only call out her name. Lin. As the memory continued, one thought remained clear. Their father had always been strict. But lately, he had become even worse. Her father hadn't always been this harsh. But over the years, his obsession had only grown worse. As a child, Idili often wondered why he treated them so differently from other families. Why was he so cruel? And why was there nothing she could do to protect Lin? Every time she saw her younger sister cry, her chest tightened. Her heart ached with anger and helplessness. Back then, Idili believed there was only one solution. If she could grow up faster. If she could become the perfect noble lady. If she could become an ideal bride from one of the great houses. Then maybe everything would finally get better. So she worked endlessly. She studied etiquette. Practiced every lesson. Attended every class. At the dining table, she forced herself to follow every rule flawlessly. Every action. Every word. Every gesture. Because she believed that if she became perfect enough, their father would finally be satisfied. And if he was satisfied, maybe Lin would stop suffering. But reality never changed. When Lin turned 16, their father's insults only became harsher. He shouted that she was already 16 and still hadn't gotten her act together. He mocked her appearance, questioned who would ever want her, and demanded to know when she would finally become useful to him. To him, Lin wasn't his daughter. She was an investment that wasn't paying off. Then he compared her to Idili again. He pointed out that Idili had already debuted in society and was making connections. Why couldn't Lin do the same? Lin could only sit there and endure it. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became uneven. Yet the criticism never stopped. Meanwhile, Idili continued chasing perfection. She kept telling herself that if she became exactly what their father wanted, everything would eventually improve. Still, a small question lingered inside her heart. Would she ever be free? One day, while looking out the window, Lin noticed a bird soaring through the sky. She watched it disappear into the distance. Free from expectations. Free from cages. Free from everything. Tears filled her eyes. Idili. She couldn't do it anymore. She didn't think she could become a noble lady like her sister. She didn't want to keep living like this. Then she ran. Past the open balcony. Past the cold wind. Toward the freedom she had always dreamed about. The only thing Lin wanted was to fly away like that bird. She reached forward. And then, everything went dark. A single feather drifted through the darkness. Then came the words that changed everything. Lin is dead. The news spread through the mansion like ice. Idili stood frozen, certain she had misheard. What do you mean she's dead? But her father didn't show grief. He didn't show shock. He didn't even show sadness. Instead, he mocked Idili for asking questions. Then he casually explained that Lin had accidentally fallen from the third-floor balcony while looking outside. As far as he was concerned, that was the end of the matter. He ordered everyone to keep quiet. No rumors. No discussions. No questions. Then, as he walked away, he clicked his tongue. I can't believe she did this during such a busy time. Those words struck Idili harder than anything else. Her sister had died, and all their father could think about was the inconvenience. The weight of the truth finally crashed down on her. Idili collapsed to the floor, tightly clutching the flower in her hands. Lin. Tears filled her eyes. As countless memories flooded back, only one question remained. Why? Why did Lin have to die? Then another memory surfaced. A memory from before Lin's death. Lynn sat crying while Ideally tried desperately to comfort her. But this time, Lynn finally put her feelings into words. She said she couldn't take it anymore. She had thoughts, feelings, dreams, and a voice that wanted to express them. Yet no one seemed willing to listen. Lynn asked how much longer she was supposed to endure. She had already endured as much as she possibly could. Then she broke down completely. My life isn't worth living anymore. The memory cut deep. Because Ideally knew exactly what Lynn meant. After meeting Barbara Celestine, Ideally had finally started to feel hope. For the first time, she believed there might be another way to live. Another future waiting for her. But that hope eventually disappeared. Lynn died. And afterward, Ideally followed the path her father had chosen for her. Just as he wanted, she married into House Lancaster. Back in the present, Ideally quietly thought about her sister. You know, Lynn, there had been a time when she wanted the same thing. A time when she had dreamed of escaping everything and running away. But unlike Lynn, Ideally never left. She endured. Because as long as Lynn was beside her, she felt she could keep going. The memory shifted again. The two sisters walking together, supporting one another, trying to survive a life neither of them had chosen. Yet looking back now, Ideally realized something painful. No one could carry the weight of a life they never asked for forever. And suddenly, her thoughts returned to the present. To Lady Linnea Chrysis. If Lady Linnea was suffering, then Ideally wanted to help her somehow. But even that thought felt hollow. Was she really in a position to teach anyone? The next day, Count Laszlo finally returned to the estate. As he stepped inside, something immediately felt wrong. The head housekeeper didn't greet him. The atmosphere throughout the mansion felt strangely tense. Laszlo found it odd. The entire reason he had accepted ownership of the estate was to provide a place for his soldiers and trusted people. Yet this didn't feel like a proper count's estate at all. Before he could think further, the front doors suddenly burst open. A small red-haired girl came running toward him. Laszlo, you're home. It was Linnea Chrysis. She greeted him enthusiastically and immediately asked how his day had been. Laszlo gave a short answer. Yeah. Then he started walking away. Linnea quickly followed behind him. Laszlo glanced back. What did you do today? He asked. Linnea froze. The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. Laszlo simply shrugged. The same thing I always do. Why do you ask? After a brief pause, he added that there was no particular reason. The two continued walking through the estate. Eventually, Laszlo stopped outside his room and looked back at her. Why did you follow me into my room? Linnea immediately became nervous. Do you have something to say? Laszlo asked. Flustered, Linnea quickly denied it. Then she awkwardly explained why she had followed him. She had received an invitation. Viscountess Emerson was hosting a social gathering. Laszlo asked whether she knew the woman. I don't. The answer immediately deflated Linnea's hopes. Seeing her reaction, Laszlo simply said that she didn't have to attend if she didn't want to, but Linnea shook her head. She insisted that if she avoided every social event, she would never get a chance to wear all the beautiful gowns she owned. Then her voice grew quieter. The real problem wasn't the party itself. She admitted that she didn't know what to say at parties. She never knew how to talk to people. After hesitating for a moment, she finally asked a favor. If Laszlo didn't mind, could he find her a decent tutor? The request surprised him. Then Laszlo spoke a name. Linnea Chrysis. His expression became serious. If I find someone decent, will you actually learn this time without throwing a tantrum? Linnea blinked in confusion. A tantrum? When had she ever done that? Laszlo didn't let her avoid the question. He reminded her that he had already hired multiple tutors for her. None of them lasted even 2 weeks. Linnea immediately tried to object. But before she could explain herself, memories resurfaced. She remembered one particular tutor. A noblewoman who constantly looked down on her. The woman repeatedly reminded Linnea that she was only a commoner. She questioned whether Linnea could even understand the material being taught. Worse still, the tutor mocked her openly. And, whenever Linnea reacted, the woman acted as if she had done nothing wrong. People laughed, whispered, looked down on her. Linnea remembered how they always pretended to be refined and sophisticated while insulting her to her face. And when she finally stood up for herself, somehow she became the problem. Back in the present, Linnea lowered her head. It's not my fault. Her hands trembled. She insisted that those tutors had pampered lives. They couldn't understand what it was like to be mocked first and expected to stay silent. Then Linnea suddenly remembered something. She says that Duchess wasn't what I expected, though. Laszlo, with a surprised look, asked, "What are you saying?" Linnea continued she held the position higher than any of the tutor that ever came here, but she had no pride at all. I told her to kneel in front of me, and she actually did. Laszlo's voice suddenly rose. "Linnea Krisis." The shout startled her so badly that she nearly jumped. "What? You scared me. Why would you yell like that?" But Laszlo wasn't joking anymore. Looking directly at her, he asked a simple question. Did she truly understand how ashamed she should be for the way she had treated someone who worked for her? Laszlo's expression darkened. He looked directly at Linnea and asked how she could force someone beneath her to kneel simply because she had authority. To him, that was exactly the kind of behavior nobles were hate so much do. Using power to trample the weak. Linnea flinched. Her hands tightened against her chest. "I know that," she muttered. But then frustration spilled out. "Why can't I do it? I want to look down on those nobles who despise me. Is that so bad?" Laszlo's answer came immediately. "No, because you never looked down on the nobles. You only mocked a maid." The words hit harder than any slap. Linnea froze. Laszlo continued. She had never dared act that way toward actual nobles. Instead, she took her anger out on someone weaker. His accusation struck a nerve. Linnea's eyes reddened. "Laszlo, you don't know what you're talking about." For years she had endured ridicule. Countless sneers. Countless insults. She never told him how much it hurt because she didn't want to burden him. Didn't want to upset him. Weren't siblings supposed to help each other? Wasn't he supposed to understand? Finally, Linnea snapped. Tears streamed down her face. "Fine. If you're such a know-it-all, then help me. If I'm struggling to talk in front of nobles, don't you care what happens to me at all?" Without waiting for an answer, she stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her. Silence returned. Laszlo stood there awkwardly. Then he let out a long sigh. Darn it. The truth was, he had no idea how to handle situations like this. Battles were easy. People were difficult. As he stood alone, an old memory resurfaced. The day he became a count. Back then, DeMarcus had told him to accept the title. Not because he wanted it. Because the mercenaries needed a symbol. A leader they could look up to. Someone who could stand as an authority figure and protect them. Laszlo had never liked noble society. Yet DeMarcus insisted that authority mattered. That sometimes people had no choice but to accept their fate. The memory left him even more conflicted. If he couldn't even handle one argument with his own sister, how was he supposed to carry the burden of an entire county? He rubbed his forehead and sighed again. Maybe he should find Linnea a proper tutor after all. Someone who could teach her how to survive among nobles. Maybe buying her an expensive necklace for the party would cheer her up too. Then another thought crossed his mind. Edele Lancaster. He wondered if she was all right. After all, she had been forced to kneel in front of Linnea. No matter what happened to her title, she had once been a duchess. What if she was crying alone right now? Laszlo immediately shook his head. Maybe he should apologize on Linnea's behalf. No, that would only embarrass his sister. He tried to stop thinking about Edele. Told himself he was worrying far too much about a woman he barely knew. Determined to clear his mind, Laszlo threw open the doors and let the freezing night air rush inside. The cold hit him instantly. Good. That felt better. He decided to drop the matter entirely. Visiting Edele at such a late hour would only create rumors. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the capital, a completely different conversation was taking place. Inside a lavish room illuminated by crystal chandeliers, a silver-haired noble calmly exhaled smoke and listened to a report. According to the report, the atmosphere among the Empire's socialites had become extremely tense since the recent banquet. The reason was simple. No one had expected the fall of Duke Lancaster's household to happen so quickly. He pressed the burning end of his cigar down onto a newspaper lying on the table. The paper contained an illustration and article connected to the recent events. The ember scorched directly through the image as smoke rose into the air. Someone powerful had finally taken notice of Laszlo. And judging by the hatred in that man's voice, this encounter was unlikely to end peacefully.